October 24th, 1944. Dawn over the Philippine Sea bled orange through the flight deck haze of the USS Essex. On the horizon, faint thunder rolled where distant strikes had already begun. Commander David McCampbell, Air Group 15's skipper, stepped onto the deck in a thin layer of salt mist. His F6F Hellcat, painted sea blue and marked Mincy 3, waited with its engine idling low. The deck crew signaled him forward. He climbed the ladder, strapped in, and brought the big Pratt & Whitney R2800 to life with a single sharp push of the mixture lever. The carrier trembled under his feet. Word had come from Combat Information Center minutes earlier. Radar screens lit with inbound contacts. Not one formation, but several. Intercepts plotted the range at roughly 60 miles, bearing due west. The numbers kept multiplying. 30, 40, then over 50 aircraft. A raid large enough to blot a sector of the sky. Japanese land-based fighters and bombers were moving in to strike the American fleet covering the Leyte landings. The timing couldn't be worse. Most of Essex's combat air patrol had just recovered from a long escort run and were refueling below deck. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, were the only ones on deck with fueled and armed aircraft ready to go. He didn't wait for an order. "We'll take a look," he said over the intercom, eyes still on the rising sun. Tower cleared them. The deck officer dropped his flag. Throttles forward. The Hellcat leapt from the carrier's bow and sank for a half-second before the torque bit into the propeller arc and lifted her into the air. Behind him, Rushing's Hellcat clawed up the same slipstream. Both aircraft climbed east toward the radar blips. Altitude, 10,000 feet, climbing. Power, 48 inches manifold pressure, 2,600 RPM. The R2800 thundered steady. McCampbell switched to Channel C, listening for other flights. Nothing but static. The rest of the division was still rearming below. It would take them 10 minutes to get airborne. The enemy was 20 minutes out. He could wait, or buy those 10 minutes himself. He throttled back slightly, balancing climb rate against fuel flow. His aircraft carried only half a load of .50 caliber ammunition, 240 rounds per gun, instead of the usual 400. That gave him roughly 24 seconds of total firing time. Enough if every burst counted. He leveled off at 18,000 feet, scanning the cloud deck ahead. Through breaks in the haze, faint silver dots shimmered in the sun. Dozens of them, arranged in tiers. Some long-winged Key 43 Oscars, others stub-winged Zeros, escorting twin-engine bombers on the deck below. Rushing's voice crackled over the radio. "That's a whole army, Skipper." "Then let's thin it out," McCampbell answered. He nosed over, rolled inverted, and dove. Airspeed wound up past 400 knots, the Hellcat vibrating in compressible air. He lined up on the trailing fighters, squeezed the trigger for a half-second burst. 6 Brownings roared, tracers stitched across the sky. One Oscar flared white, then black smoke poured from its engine as it spiraled down. He pulled up hard, G-forces pressing into his chest. Above and to the right, Rushing scored another. 2 fires blooming in quick sequence. The enemy formation broke, elements scattering into defensive turns. The radio filled with overlapping Japanese chatter. They re-entered from above again, diving through the confusion. McCampbell fired another 1-second burst into a Zero, pulling up from its dive. The canopy exploded, fragments peeling away like foil. The Hellcat's stability let him pull out at 280 knots without a stall, something the lighter Japanese fighters couldn't risk. He climbed vertically again, watching vapor stream from the wingtips. 2 kills. Maybe more below, but no time to verify. He glanced at the fuel gauge, 140 gallons remaining. enough for roughly 45 minutes at combat power. He'd already burned through 60 in the climb and first engagement. Ammunition counters clicked down, maybe half his rounds gone. Still, he pressed back in. The Japanese regrouped at lower altitude, roughly 12,000 feet, and tried to climb back toward the bombers. McCampbell rolled into the sun, used its glare to mask his dive, and came down behind another formation. 3 Zeros in line abreast, all focused forward. He fired from 400 yards, walking tracers through the center plane. It disintegrated instantly. A second burst caught the left wing fighter, wings separating cleanly at the root. He kicked right rudder and avoided the debris. 4 down now. The third pilot broke into a climbing spiral. McCampbell followed, rolling inside his turn, pulling 4 Gs, the Hellcat's airframe groaning, but holding. A short burst at 150 yards. The Zero burst into flames. 5. Rushing's voice came again, tight with strain. "Fuel's half, Skipper." "Keep them busy. Don't chase down low," McCampbell said, knowing full well he'd ignore that advice. Below them, the bombers had turned back east. Their escort was in disarray. The next 15 minutes turned into a pattern. Climb, dive, fire, climb again. McCampbell worked purely by numbers. Altitude advantage 3,000 feet, dive angle 25 degrees, firing window 2 seconds, breakaway at 300 knots. Every pass, another plume of smoke. His 50 caliber guns spat bright streaks that cut through the enemy's lightweight fuselages like saws through fabric. The Japanese pilots tried to turn inside him, but the Hellcat's heavy frame carried momentum through vertical maneuvers they couldn't match. Where they lost speed in hard turns, he converted altitude into energy and stayed unpredictable. 7 kills tallied by visual count now. Rushing reported 2 more, 9 aircraft destroyed between them. Still, the sky looked no emptier. There were always more shapes crossing the clouds. McCampbell eased into a climbing spiral and checked instruments. Oil pressure, good. Cylinder head temperature, 210 degrees Celsius. Fuel, 80 gallons, barely enough for the return leg. Ammunition counter, less than 200 rounds total, maybe 2 seconds of firing time. He looked east. The fleet lay beyond the horizon. If he pushed farther west, he'd never make it back. He leveled off, scanning for stragglers. 2 Zeros broke off from the main group, trying to reach cloud cover. He dove on them from high 6 o'clock, a textbook position. The first burst struck the lead plane square in the engine. The second Zero broke formation, rolled left. McCampbell fired a half-second burst and its tail sheared away. He pulled up hard, feeling the weight of G-forces slow the blood in his head. 9. He knew the count now because his guns were nearly empty, and there was nothing else left to shoot at. The radio crackled. "Skipper, we better head home." "I'm almost dry." "Copy that," McCampbell said quietly. He turned east, throttled back to conserve fuel, climbed just enough to stretch the glide ratio. The R-2800 hummed steadily at 1,600 RPM. He adjusted mixture for lean cruise, watching every needle for the first hint of sputter. Below them, the scattered wrecks of enemy aircraft burned on the waves, thin columns of smoke, marking where the sky had erupted minutes earlier. As the coastline of Samar faded behind them, the realization set in. They'd gone up against roughly 60 aircraft and come back with the sky cleared. 9 confirmed, perhaps more falling unseen into the clouds below. And neither of them had taken a single hit. McCampbell reached down and tapped the fuel gauge again, barely above the red. He glanced at the ammunition counter. 2 rounds left. Enough, he thought, to scare the next man he saw. They descended toward the faint gray outline of Task Group 38.3, the Essex's battle group, its wakes white against the blue Pacific. The radio operator on the carrier announced, Blue leader, you are cleared to land. Deck ready. McCampbell smiled behind his oxygen mask. He still had to bring the Hellcat home on fumes. He adjusted his descent rate with 2 fingers on the throttle, eyes fixed on the deck pattern below. The wind streamed over the canopy, loud even through his headset. The Hellcat came down steeply, the prop barely keeping revolutions steady on what little fuel remained. Essex, this is Mincy 3, coming in dead stick in 60 seconds, McCampbell radioed, knowing the engine could quit at any moment. The reply was calm. Copy, Mincy 3. You're cleared to trap. We've got you. The carrier grew larger through the haze. Tiny figures of deck crew running to take position. LSO flags poised. He dropped gear, flaps, and adjusted trim with small, deliberate touches. The big radial coughed once, then caught again, rough and uneven. Fuel gauge now at 0. He could feel the tank nearly dry beneath him. Every second of power mattered. His final turn aligned with the landing wires, the ship's wake trailing straight as a guide rope. At 100 feet, he reduced throttle just enough to settle onto the deck. The hook caught the 3rd wire with a thud that rattled his teeth. The Hellcat rolled to a stop, tail high, engine still sputtering. The deck crew surged forward. Someone reached up and unlatched his canopy. He pulled off his oxygen mask. The smell of burnt oil and cordite hung in the air. How much fuel? The flight officer asked, leaning in. McCampbell checked the gauge again. A pint, maybe, he said. Behind him, Rushing's Hellcat came in next, catching the wire and stopping short. Both planes were on deck, both pilots unscathed. When McCampbell climbed down, his legs trembled, not from fear, but from the sudden end of motion. He glanced back at the aircraft. The nose was blackened from cordite exhaust, gun barrels scorched, leading edges pitted with spent casings. A crewman stood by the wing with a clipboard. "Ammunition check?" he asked. McCampbell nodded. The crew pulled the gun bay covers and called out the count. 2 rounds left total, 1 each in the upper guns. That was all. "You timed it close, Commander," the chief said with a grin. "Close enough," McCampbell replied. He followed the crew below deck to the ready room. The noise of engines faded as another launch cycle began topside. Inside, maps were spread across the table, radios hissing with fragments of reports. Other divisions had scrambled during the fight, but arrived too late to engage. Combat Information Center confirmed the radar contacts had dispersed or turned back. The fleet had taken no hits. McCampbell and Rushing had intercepted the raid alone and broken it apart. The intelligence officer took their debrief. McCampbell described the enemy formation. 60, maybe more, mixed Zeeks and Oscars with bombers below. They were stacked like a beehive, he said, sketching rough circles on the map. We hit them from the top. They never recovered cohesion. He marked 9 enemy aircraft destroyed by visual confirmation. 2 on first pass, 3 more in consecutive dives, 4 during pursuit at lower altitude. Rushing confirmed his own count of 3. 2 confirmed, burning on impact. The officer jotted figures. "We'll have film from your gun cameras in an hour," he said. McCampbell nodded. He didn't need the film. He could still see the sequence of each kill in his mind. The flashes, the smoke. The brief moments when everything slowed down to pure geometry. Later, in the ready room, the squadron gathered around the film projector as maintenance crew loaded the reels. The black and white footage flickered to life. McCampbell's Hellcat diving through a swarm of dark specks. Tracers arced forward, connecting the dots in bright lines. A 0 bloomed into flame, then another. You could hear low whistles from the pilots watching. Half disbelief, half admiration. Someone muttered, "Looks like he's cutting wheat." Another replied, "9 of them. That's the record." The film ended with the sky empty except for drifting smoke. When the lights came back up, no one spoke for a long moment. The after-action report written that night summarized it with typical brevity. Commander, McCampbell, F6F 5, 9. Enemy fighters destroyed. Rushing, 3. No friendly losses. Raid dispersed before reaching task group. But the data told a deeper story. In 25 minutes of combat, 2 aircraft had neutralized a strike of 60. Average firing time per kill, less than 2 seconds. Ammunition expended, 1,400 rounds. That meant roughly 150 rounds per kill, a fraction of the usual 400. It was the most efficient single sortie recorded by the U.S. Navy. That efficiency wasn't luck. McCampbell knew the Hellcat's numbers intimately. The F6F's 6 Browning M2 machine guns fired 800 rounds per minute each, giving a total rate of fire near 8,000 RPM. At typical convergence distance of 250 yards, all 6 streams overlapped into a cone about 6 feet wide. The Japanese fighters, lighter and less armored, could not survive even a half-second burst. The plane's 2,000 horsepower engine allowed vertical maneuvers that their inline engines couldn't match. It could dive at 400 knots without shedding wings and still climb back with power to spare. The data explained why the battle had gone the way it did. The design had turned numbers into survival. McCampbell spent the next hours writing his combat notes, describing throttle settings, dive angles, burst lengths, and how he managed energy through the engagement. Short bursts only. Never hold the trigger, he wrote. Climb vertically, out of turn. Don't dogfight. Keep altitude advantage. Those notes would later circulate among other squadrons, forming the basis for training lectures on energy fighting. The lesson was mathematical. Altitude equals options, and ammunition is time. By evening, the sun had set behind Leyte Gulf. The fleet's lights glowed faintly on the horizon. The carrier's loudspeakers announced total air victories of the day. Dozens of kills across Task Force 38, but none as concentrated as McCampbell's. When he walked the deck again, mechanics were already refueling Mincy 3. The engine cowling was open, oil streaked black from heat. A young mechanic wiping his hands looked up. "You going back up tomorrow, Commander?" McCampbell smiled faintly. "If they are," he said, nodding toward the dark horizon, "then we are." He knew the numbers wouldn't last forever. Every engagement carried a probability curve. Enemy numbers, fuel range, ammunition supply, mechanical reliability. Each time you beat the odds, the next climb felt narrower. But that day, everything had aligned. The engineering, the tactics, and the human decisions made in seconds that tilted entire operations. That night, the Essex's combat air patrol logs recorded one of the lowest loss ratios of the entire Philippine campaign. Not a single ship in the task group had been hit. The Hellcats had stripped the attack force before it could close. In the quiet hours after debrief, McCampbell walked alone along the deck edge. The sea stretched black beneath him, phosphorescent trails glowing faintly in the wake. He thought about the empty fuel tank, the last 2 rounds, the sound of tracers cutting through air. 9 kills in 1 mission, a statistic that would be written down, printed, and remembered. But what stayed with him was how close the margin had been. He glanced aft, where Rushing's aircraft was parked under floodlights, crews still wiping soot from the wings. The young ensign had flown like a veteran, calm and disciplined. Without that cover, McCampbell knew he wouldn't have come back. He made a note to mention him in the morning briefing. The night air smelled of fuel and salt. Somewhere below, the carrier's engines thrummed steady, pushing east toward the next day's operations. In less than 6 hours, they'd launch again. McCampbell leaned on the railing, eyes on the stars over Leyte. He thought about how much of war came down to numbers, gallons, rounds, degrees, seconds, and how the smallest surplus in any one of them could decide whether you saw another sunrise. Dawn returned fast in the tropics. The next morning, the flight deck was already alive by 0500 hours, heat shimmering from the exhaust stacks as crews armed and fueled the planes. The previous day's engagement had already become a story moving through the fleet. Messages came over radio circuits between carriers. Commander McCampbell, 9 victories. The phrasing was simple, but every pilot listening understood what that meant. It wasn't just numbers. It was proof that a 2-plane intercept could alter the course of a day's operations. McCampbell was back on the bridge with his flight gear half-zipped, coffee in hand, when Airplot updated the morning board. Radar sweeps showed scattered returns west of Samar. Nothing dense, just remnants of the same air group retreating to Luzon. The Essex was cycling strike aircraft for the next phase of Leyte operations. McCampbell had another job now: turn the previous day's raw fight into training. He met his pilots in the ready room, chalkboard already covered with lines and arcs. "All right, gentlemen," he began, voice quiet but carrying through the room. Yesterday's engagement wasn't about luck. It was about numbers. Fuel, ammo, altitude. Every decision came down to those key. He drew a crude line diagram showing his dive angles. We had a 60-plane raid inbound. We engaged with 2. Here's what worked. Here's why he broke down the encounter like an engineer. Starting altitude 18,000 feet. Enemy altitude 12,000. Initial dive angle 25 degrees. Closure rate approximately 300 miles per hour. First pass, half-second burst at 400 yards. At that speed, your bullets are in flight for just under half a second. Don't chase the target. Lead the closure vector. You'll see the hit before you hear the guns. He ran through fuel figures, mixture settings, even prop pitch changes he made during climbs. Each detail was small, but it turned chaotic combat into a system others could replicate. One pilot raised a question. "Sir, why not wait for backup? 2 planes against 60. Could have been suicide." McCampbell nodded. "Could have been," he said. "But the fleet didn't have 10 minutes. We had an inbound raid closing at 200 knots. 10 minutes delay would have put them over the task group. If you've got altitude, you've got initiative. If you've got initiative, you've already halved the enemy's options." The men wrote notes silently. They all knew those 10 minutes had made the difference between a report and a disaster. After the briefing, he went topside. Maintenance was finishing a full inspection on Mincy 3. The mechanics had cleaned every gun bore, replaced 2 frayed ignition wires, and polished the canopy glass until it looked like water. One of them handed McCampbell the data sheet. "We pulled the gun camera reels, sir. 9 confirmed by film, 2 more probable. That's 11 total if you count smoke trails without impact footage." McCampbell looked down at the paper. "9's enough," he said. "No sense arguing with film grain." What mattered more was what came next. The Battle of Leyte Gulf wasn't a single fight. It was a chain of engagements that stretched over 3 days and involved nearly every major surface and air unit in the Western Pacific. The Japanese had launched 4 separate naval task forces to attack the invasion fleet from different directions. Every hour of delay gave American forces more time to concentrate and respond. McCampbell's interception had been one small link in that chain, 2 pilots against 60, but it bought those hours. In the Combat Information Center, analysts had already measured the impact. The Japanese formation he broke up had been part of a coordinated strike from Luzon, scheduled to attack the carriers at 0930. After McCampbell's interception, radar tracked only scattered returns. Less than half of the original force reached strike range. The rest either turned back or ditched from fuel starvation after evasive maneuvers. No bombs were dropped on Essex's task group that morning. That data fed into the fleet's operational reports. At the tactical level, it meant fewer attacks, fewer casualties, fewer holes in decks. At the strategic level, it preserved the entire air wing's sortie schedule. Every pilot knew what that meant. When one man held the line for 10 minutes, 100 others came back alive. By noon, orders came from Task Force 38's headquarters. McCampbell and Rushing were grounded for the afternoon. Mandatory rest. It wasn't punishment, it was preservation. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 2 days, but even rest wasn't quiet on a carrier. The noise of launches never stopped. From his cabin, he could feel the vibration through the deck plates. He took the time to review combat film frame by frame, studying how tracers converged and where bursts took effect. At 1 frame per second, you could see everything combat compressed into fractions of a heartbeat. The way the enemy's wing flexed under impact, the delay before flame bloomed from the engine. It wasn't spectacle. It was data. Every frame showed where his aim points had been precise or wasted. Late afternoon, a message arrived from Admiral Halsey's staff. For extraordinary performance in air combat, 9 enemy aircraft destroyed in one mission. Recommend highest commendation. McCampbell folded the paper and set it aside. He knew the commendations mattered to the record, but not to the math. Tomorrow's sorties would demand the same discipline no matter what hung from his uniform. As the sun began to set, he walked aft again to the flight deck. Rushing stood near the railing, watching the water. "You think they'll try again?" he asked. McCampbell nodded slowly. "They have to. It's all they've got left." Rushing kicked at a tie-down chain and smiled faintly. "Then we'll be waiting." The sea air was cooler now, wind whipping across the deck. McCampbell looked out at the horizon. The war had turned a corner. The Japanese Navy had gambled everything at Leyte, and the odds were tilting. But even as strategy shifted, the fight in the air remained brutally personal. One pilot, one engine, one set of numbers that decided if you lived. He turned back toward the parked planes, rows of Hellcats catching the last red light of the evening. Each one was a machine built around a single principle: absorb punishment and deliver it back twice over. Every bolt, every hydraulic line, every bit of riveted skin was part of that arithmetic. For all the chaos of battle, the outcomes were mechanical. When the design was sound and the pilot steady, the result was survival. That night, the Essex logged 147 sorties, launched and recovered without incident. The sea was calm. The air groups across the fleet had destroyed more than 300 enemy aircraft over Leyte in 48 hours. McCampbell's 9 remained the highest single mission tally of them all. He stayed awake long after lights out, listening to the hum of the ventilation and the distant echo of arrestor cables slapping the deck above. In his mind, the engagement replayed again and again. The climb, the dive, the guns, the silence afterward. He realized how thin the margin had been between 9 kills and none at all. 2 minutes later, departure. 1 misfired gun, 1 leaking fuel line, and the outcome could have been reversed entirely. That was the truth every combat pilot lived with. Success measured in fractions of seconds and gallons. Never absolutes. The next morning, the sound of the general quarters alarm cut through his sleep. Another raid forming on radar. He grabbed his flight suit from the hook, boots hitting the deck before the announcement even finished. Routine returned instantly. There was no ceremony in it, no thought of yesterday's records. only the same sequence: fuel, arm, brief, launch. He moved to the ready room, scanning the board for his name. Air Group 15. Standby. He smiled slightly. Rest time was over. When he climbed the ladder to the deck once more, the light was just the same as it had been the day before. Blinding sun over a flat blue sea. Engines rumbled, propellers flashed. The deck officer signaled, and McCampbell gave a thumbs up to the crew chief. Another flight. Another chance to turn math into survival. The sound of the Hellcat's engine filled the air as the plane rolled forward, tail lifting, then vanished into the bright horizon, still carrying the calm certainty of a man who knew exactly what every second of fuel and every round of ammunition meant. By mid-morning, the new radar tracks had thinned. What the operators first thought was another massive raid turned out to be fragments, small reconnaissance flights trying to gauge the fleet's position after the losses of the previous day. McCampbell and Rushing were held on deck, engines running, then finally waved down. The big air battle over Leyte was already breaking apart. In the ready room afterward, pilots crowded around the map table as fresh reports arrived from other task groups. North of Luzon, carrier-based Hellcats from Intrepid and Langley were mopping up retreating aircraft. Farther south, Ticonderoga's strike group had destroyed 2 airfields in the Visayas. The Japanese aerial threat was collapsing. The talk around the table had none of the bravado people imagined from fighter pilots. They discussed fuel burn rates, gun reliability, convergence settings. 2 rounds short of empty, one pilot muttered, shaking his head. Can't believe you made it back on that. McCampbell smiled slightly. 2's plenty if you don't waste the first 1,200. Later that day, the engineering officer came to the ready room carrying a clipboard. We ran the numbers on your flight data, Commander, he said. Engine ran for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Average manifold pressure 42 inches. Average RPM 2,400. Fuel burned 219 gallons. Estimated range left on approach 5 miles. You weren't exaggerating about fumes. He handed McCampbell the sheet. Maintenance crews say the barrels are clean. No stress cracks. Planes ready for next sortie. McCampbell scanned the report, nodded, and handed it back. Good, he said. Keep it that way. The following afternoon, the Essex turned north to rejoin the main carrier formation. The sea was calm, a thin haze over the horizon. Down below, the Leyte beaches were already crowded with landing craft, bulldozers and rows of supply trucks crawling up the sand. From 18,000 feet, the invasion looked orderly, almost peaceful. But everyone aboard the carriers knew that air cover was the reason it held. Without it, those rows of vehicles would have been burning. 2 days later, formal confirmation came through. McCampbell's claim of 9 had been verified by gun camera film and radar analysis. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in aerial combat over Leyte Gulf, in which Commander McCampbell, single-handed, and with 1 wingman, engaged and destroyed 9 enemy aircraft out of an attacking force of superior size." The wording was stiff, the way military citations always were, but behind the words was a simple fact. No other American pilot had ever done what he'd done in a single mission. He didn't celebrate. That evening, he walked the hangar deck, watching crews load ammunition belts into waiting planes. Long rows of Browning .50 caliber rounds slid into the feed chutes, brass glinting under fluorescent light. He ran his fingers along one of the belts, feeling the smooth cases. Every 5th round was an orange tracer. It struck him how impersonal the weapons seemed, yet how personal the results always were. That night he wrote a short letter to his wife Mary back home in Florida. He kept it simple. Still flying, still safe. The boys are doing good work. It's hot here, but the sea's calm. Thinking of you. He didn't mention the mission. There was no way to describe it in a few lines of ink that would survive the censors. By November, the Leyte operation had turned into a full campaign. The Japanese fleet's last gamble, the attempt to attack through the San Bernardino Strait, had failed. McCampbell led strikes across the remaining pockets of resistance. The Hellcats flew nearly constant patrols. Every sortie added to the total, but none matched that morning of October 24th. It wasn't just the number of kills, it was the concentration, the precision. Pilots across the Pacific began referring to the event simply as the Nine, shorthand for the day one man and his wingman had emptied the sky. When the Essex finally returned to Leyte for replenishment, McCampbell was called to Admiral Halsey's flagship. The deck of New Jersey was quiet that afternoon, the Admiral's staff assembled under the awning. Halsey shook his hand and said, "You've given the boys something to aim for." McCampbell smiled politely, but what stayed with him was the look on the Admiral's face, part pride, part relief. Victories were never isolated. Each one fed the momentum that carried fleets, kept sailors alive, shortened the war. He was awarded the Medal of Honor months later, but by then he had flown so many sorties that the paperwork seemed detached from reality. 9 kills in one mission looked neat in print, but it left out the sound of the engine straining, the smell of gunpowder, the way the horizon vanished in smoke. He accepted the medal quietly, said the words expected of him, and returned to duty. Years later, after the war, reporters would ask how it felt. He always gave the same answer. It was just another mission. But his logbook told the rest of the story. Every line of data carefully recorded. Altitude, airspeed, ammunition used, rounds remaining, oil temp, manifold pressure, fuel on landing. It read like an engineer's diary, not a warrior's. The numbers told the truth in a way memory couldn't. By the time McCampbell retired from the Navy, the Hellcat was already long obsolete, replaced by jets whose speed exceeded anything he'd imagined. But among carrier aviators, his record remained a benchmark. 9 in one flight, 34 in the war, all in the same simple blue-painted machine built to climb, dive, and take punishment. In later years, he visited air shows where restored F6Fs flew for crowds that barely remembered Leyte Gulf. The planes looked small now, almost quaint, their radial engines shaking the air with that familiar deep thunder. He would stand quietly at the edge of the tarmac, hands clasped behind his back, watching the prop blur into a disk of light. If someone recognized him and asked about that day, he'd just shrug. "The airplane did most of the work," he'd say. "I just kept it pointed in the right direction." For the men who had been there, that humility rang true. The Hellcat had been an instrument of precision, built by engineers who understood that survival in combat wasn't about drama. It was about reliable math, thrust, drag, weight, firepower. McCampbell had proven what happened when those numbers met the right pair of hands. Long after the noise of war faded, the lesson of that morning stayed the same. 2 men, 1 machine, 60 opponents. No speeches, no theatrics. Just the steady application of skill and engineering under pressure. When you strip away the chaos, that's what combat always came down to. And when historians later wrote that the Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the moment Japan's naval air arm ceased to exist as an organized force, buried in the footnotes was the smallest of details. The morning 2 Hellcats climbed into the sun and never turned back. Please subscribe to the channel if you liked the video. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. We'll see you tomorrow with the next one.